Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unscripted. In today's episode, a person's a person, no matter how small. Today, we are talking about Horton Hears a Who.
And even though you can't hear or see them at all, a person's a person, no matter how small.
The 2008 version, not the original 1970s version. Now, for this 2008 film, it was directed by Jimmy Hayward and Steve Martino. The screenplay was written by Cinco Paul and Ken Dario, two names you might recognize if you listened to last episode about Despicable Me. They also wrote the script for that film. And it is based on the book by Dr. Seuss, Horton Hears a Who. The producers were Bruce Anderson and Bob Gordon, executive producer Audrey Geisel, Chris Meledandri, and Chris Wedge, and it was produced by Blue Sky Studios. Now, with a movie like this that goes from book to film, as always, we talk a little bit about the book before we actually talk about the film itself. So, let's do a quick book summary and then we'll get into the movie today. And this book was written by Dr. Seuss and was adapted into an animated film in 2008. The book follows the journey of Horton the elephant as he finds a small speck with tiny people on it and fights to save them. The 2008 is practically the same storyline, whereas the original 1970 film strays a little bit from the original source material. So the book and the film in this episode, they are, for the most part, very, very similar. The production for this film took about 3.5 years from beginning to end. The total runtime is 86 minutes, and this film had an estimated budget of about $85 million. The screenplay, again, was by Cinco Paul and Ken Dario, and Cinco and Ken, after working on Santa Claus 2 with Disney, worked on a few other things. They wrote a script titled Let It Rain, and sold it to Disney. That script, however, was never made into a movie, but Chris Meledandri read it and loved it, so he contacted them for Horton Hears a Who and told them that he wanted them to write it. And Horton Hears a Who, fun fact, was actually Ken Dario's favorite book. Then they met with Mrs. Seuss, Audrey Geisel. She had approval because she didn't like the way The Cat in the Hat had turned out. So after meeting with them, she said it was okay. She knew the story was in good hands as long as it was with them. And this was Cinco and Ken's first experience with animation. Now, when writing the script, they took the original text from the story and expanded on it. So they added the Whoville story and the mayor's character, because if you've read the original book, there's not really much of a story behind Whoville or the mayor. So if you read the book, you kind of notice that there are some gaps in the story that aren't really filled in at all. And Ken and Cinco, when they were writing this film, they had the opportunity to kind of take those gaps and fill them in with story themselves. And the first draft of an animated film can take months to write. But after that, you're pretty much rewriting the script every day for 2 or more years. And they were writing things that were in production while they were writing them. So a scene could have been in the animation process, and they were still writing the script for that scene. Characters are also being designed and developed and scenes storyboarded all while this script is being written. And because of this, what would happen is they would turn pages in as soon as they had an act written, and as soon as that had been turned in, the storyboarding for those pages would begin. So now you have a little bit about the scripting process for this film. You can't have a film without a cast. So we have our script, it's time to get our cast. So we have Jim Carrey as the voice of Horton, Steve Carell as the mayor, Carol Burnett as the kangaroo, Will Arnett as Vlad, Seth Rogen as Morton, Dan Fogler as the councilman and Yuma Wickersham, Isla Fisher as Dr. Mary Lou LaRue, Jonah Hill as Tommy, Amy Poehler as Sally O'Malley, Jamie Presley as Mrs. Quilligan, Charles Osgood as the narrator, Josh Flitter as Rudy, Nacy Nash as Miss Yelp, Jesse McCartney as JoJo, Joey King as Katie, with many, many more people who provided some additional voices for the film. Now, Horton Hears a Who was not Jim Carrey's first Dr. Seuss project. In the year 2000, he starred as the Grinch in the live-action How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And when casting was being done for Horton Hears a Who, Audrey Geisel, Dr. Seuss's widow, asked Carrey to be the voice of Horton because of how impressed she was by his performance as the Grinch. And Carrey had always wanted to do a CG animated film, and he said he was kind of just waiting for the perfect idea and perfect story to come along for him. And for him, that story and idea was Horton Hears a Who. And when they were casting for this movie, they knew early on that they wanted actors who were great at improv. Not so that they would write the story, but instead so that a sense of depth and realness could be brought into the characters and the film. And Horton's one of those characters, he's got a big imagination and he defies expectations. So when they were looking for the voice of Horton, they listened to a lot of Carrey's movies and the characters that he created with his voice. And they knew he was the right choice. And on top of that, he was also, as previously said, chosen by Dr. Seuss's wife for this as well. Now, Carrey provided range. He could give a big, broad performance, then return to the heartfelt center that is Horton by using his regular voice. Now, when it came to Horton as a character, kind of as a whole, this whole process for Horton was a big process. There was a lot of work they needed to put into it, a lot of thought, and because of this, they had a lot of meetings that were just centered around Horton himself. They wanted him to be a character that people would root for, and they wanted to take him on a difficult journey. But they also wanted him to have fun interactions. They wanted him to be a fun, energetic character, all while having him go on this long, difficult journey to save the Whos. And they eventually, in all of these meetings, landed on Carrey using his natural voice because they didn't want a character. They wanted Carrey. His natural voice brought a sort of heart and soul into Horton. It was a comedic film, and he was able to bring in a lot of funny moments, and he still did a lot of voice manipulation, but at the center of this character was Jim himself. And through his natural voice, he was able to give a lot of the heart and soul that he had to Horton. And we talked a little bit about the character design and the animation and how all of that is being done while the script is being written, but I want to go a little bit more into depth for those things. The lead animator on this film was Dave Torres, and there were a total of 70 animators on the film because of the scope and the tight timeline that the film had. They had a lot of background characters. I'm sure you noticed if you've ever watched this movie that especially in Whoville, there's just a lot of Whos that they have to fill space in with. It's a whole population, a whole planet of Whos. So lots and lots of background characters. And they were working with an animation style that was unlike any style in any film that any of them had ever done before. And Horton was designed to match the kind of expressive guy that Carrey is. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but Jim Carrey has the nickname of Rubber Face because of how expressive he is with his face and the way he can move and contort his face into different expressions. And they used that rubber face that Carrey had kind of as inspiration for a lot of the things that Horton does as well. And Torres, our lead animator, he worked very closely with other animators working on Horton to make sure he stayed on model and to help to evolve Horton's personality. And in animation, we also have the rigs, and I'll explain exactly what they are a little bit later. But I want to get into the difficulty that these rigs actually caused them during the films. And the rigs they used in the animation, they caused a slowdown because a lot of these rigs were they were a little heavier than the regular rigs that they would use, because for Horton they needed a bigger rig. It's for an elephant. And it's not like they hadn't animated elephants before, but Horton is a little bit different just because of the way his character is. There's a lot they have to make him do that they've never made another elephant do before. So Torres, he wasn't a part of the design process, but he did say in an interview that they tried to preserve what they could see in the books. So, for example, they tried to mirror things in the book, like how Horton lines things up small to large or large to small, or he would stack things in threes. Things like that they would take from the book and put into the film to keep it as close as they possibly could to the original source material. And it was decided early on that Horton would be a quadruped and bipedal, so that he could go from standing on all fours to then standing on twos, and he could talk with his hands and be more expressive. With this, they wanted to be able to make him more cartoony. So Torres worked very closely with the rigging for months to get Horton right. It was a very difficult process, and the riggers would create the rig, then Torres would test it. And the first rig was a quadruped rig, and halfway through, the directors decided Horton would be quadruped and bipedal. So they essentially started over and tried again. And what came out was bipedal 40% of the time, and then the rest of the time, he was a quadruped. To do this, they actually had to re-engineer the spine of the character so that it worked the way a quadruped would. But they also had a switch in the rig that would make it so that his body looked like a teardrop, and that would maneuver the fat around a little bit so that he could also work on 2 legs instead of 4. Now they had this rig that was quadruped and biped, and this made it very heavy, which in turn also made it very slow. So they had to figure out how to make it faster. And they did lots of tests going from 4 legs to 2 legs to get it right. In the end, to make this rig faster, what they did was they created a set of what they called disable sets. And these disable sets made it so that they could disable a part of the rig, so if they were working with Horton's body, they could disable his face, and vice versa. If they were working with his face, they could disable his body. And that made it so that the rig worked faster because they were now only working with part of it instead of all of it. And when animating Horton, they didn't want him to be like a regular elephant. They wanted him to be surprising and different. And they wanted him to be fun and entertaining, kind of like I said before. They went to the Geisel Library at the University of San Diego to study the original art, the pen work, and how Horton was created. And this was very important because if you notice, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, the artwork is very Seuss-esque, but if you look closely at Horton, he is almost exactly like Horton from the book, but instead of being 2D and flat, he is 3D, and he looks just like if you were to take Horton off the page, minus a few, with a few changes, but almost exactly the same. And some of those changes I'll talk about a little bit later because some of those changes were actually requested by Carrie or suggested by Carrie. Another thing they had on the character were some controls that could help them give Horton all of the different emotions that Dr. Seuss had given him in the drawings. So if you've read the book and looked at all the illustrations, Horton is a very expressive character, even in the book. They wanted to take this and incorporate it into Horton's character in the film. And Carrie, here's one of those differences that I was talking about earlier. Carrie told the animators that Horton's mouth actually needed to be bigger. So one of the differences from book to film is actually the size of Horton's mouth. In the drawings and the illustrations in the books, Horton has a rather small mouth. But in the film, he has a very large, wide mouth, which allows for Horton to be more expressive and comedic in the film. So for animated movies, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll also make sculptures of characters, and when they do that, they'll make the sculptures and then scan them into the computer later on to make the animation process a little bit quicker, you know. And that's exactly what they did here with Horton Hears a Who. They made a whole bunch of sculpts of Horton to test for how far they could stretch and squash his face. The sculpting team, they did mostly clay sculpts, but they also did some computer work. So what they would do is they would transition between 2D art and 3D model building. And there were certain things that they had to do to make sure Horton could speak and emote properly, and that's where the clay models would come in. And sculpting, they would make several different sculpts of Horton to try and capture his essence in clay. They would finish a model, then they would scan it into the computer, and after scanning the model into the computer, it becomes more animation friendly for the riggers to work with. And then after that is where all of your rigging would start. So we're going to rewind just a little bit, and I'm now going to tell you exactly what a rig is now that we've gone over just how that affected them and how that process fully works. A rig is like a skeleton inside of the character, but it's built with controls that bring it to life. And Horton's rig was huge. The crew said that Horton's rig was just a nightmare to work with sometimes. So if you know what an armature is, think of it like that. It's kind of like a digital armature. And if you're familiar with what an armature is like a metal skeleton that you put inside of clay figures for stop motion animation. And that's exactly what a rig is inside of a computer. It's just a computerized armature that you put inside of the animated characters in a film. And here we'll get a little bit into the animation process. We'll talk a little bit about the recording process as well for some of the actors. Much like most other animated movies, the animators would act scenes out themselves to kind of get an idea of how they wanted to animate something. And the Horton Hears a Who team, they would listen to the actors' recording sessions over and over and over again. Then they would record themselves acting out the sessions to get reference film for the for animating, and that would help them to kind of move along and have an idea of how exactly they wanted to do a shot or scene. And the animators, when they were doing this, they would shoot about 20 minutes of reference. Then they would take their favorite movements, gestures, or expressions and cut them together to make a sort of master reference. And sometimes the animators would even take some of the things that the actors did and they would incorporate it into the characters as they were animating. They were able to do this because when the actors were in the recording studios, first of all, they would be in the booths individually. They were never recording with others. They worked solo pretty much the entire time. It was just them in the booth. And when doing this, what they do is they record their lines several different ways, and there's also a camera on their faces that is there to help the animators get some reference. If you look, you can find some behind the scenes for animated feature films, and you'll see a lot of it is in the booth and it's on the actors, and it's a lot of fun to watch. But you'll notice, like, even with an animated film, when they're just recording their voice, they still kind of become the character physically, and they do a lot of silly things sometimes. It's like they're acting out the movie. They're becoming the character as more than just a voice. They are becoming the character themselves as if they would if it was a live action film. It's really cool. So if you haven't ever seen anything like that, I recommend watching, like going to find a video like that and watching it. It's quite fascinating, actually. So they would have that camera on their faces, and that camera would capture footage of the actors, and it would give the animators more reference to work with. And just like live action movies, animated movies, they also have set design and just design in general. We're going to talk a little bit about the sets and stuff that you find in the movies, just very briefly, because if you take a look at it, like, Dr. Seuss is a very unique art style. If you take a look at his books and all of the work that Dr. Seuss has done, you notice there's not a lot of straight lines. It's a lot of curved shapes. There's not a straight line in sight. when doing the design and the sets in this film, the shape and the texture of everything, they're very recognizable and very Seuss-esque. And the goal was to design everything and make it all look like it was done by Dr. Seuss's hand. And I think they actually did a very good job in this, because if you really think about it, it does look like Dr. Seuss did it. Instead of it being 2D, it's brought to life and it's three-dimensional. And it does look like it was done by Dr. Seuss's hand, so they did do a very good job in that, in my opinion. And when they were doing this, what they wanted to do was they wanted to keep the 2D look, but they wanted to expand on that look to make it 3D and moving. So what they did was they created a style guide. And this style guide was based on Dr. Seuss's work to keep the film accurate. It was kind of like a set of rules to help them with the set and the design in the film. And then we have our score and our soundtrack, and this was very fascinating to look into because of one of the contraptions that they have in this film. It was very fascinating, in my opinion. The music was composed by John Powell, and the score for the film was tracked at the Newman Scoring Stage at Fox. The sound effects and the music, they were orchestrated to seamlessly tie together. In this film, there's a contraption. It's JoJo's Rube Goldberg contraption, and in this contraption there are gears, drums, bows on saws, giant rubber balls on trampolines, lots of crazy things in this contraption. And what they wanted to do with this was they wanted to make all of it come together and sound like it was an industrial symphony orchestra. To do this, Powell recorded lots of exotic musical instruments for the sequence, and Randy Thorne and the sound effects team, they did the same thing with sound effects. And then Pete Horner flew to LA to help the music editors sort through all of the elements that they had gathered together for this sequence that they had for the machine, and in the end, the coordination of the music and the sound effects all came together and worked out really, really well. And then finally, we come to the box office and release of the film. Horton Hears a Who was released in the United States and Canada on March 16th, 2008. And the final runtime was an hour and 26 minutes, just like we said in the beginning, 86 minutes long. It was distributed by 20th Century Fox. The domestic box office was $154,529,439, with an international box office of $144,043,360. Coming to a total worldwide box office of $298,572,799. And as always, we also have our awards and nominations. This film has 1 win and 18 nominations. We're going to go through just a couple of them, starting with the win. John Powell, in 2009, he was nominated and he actually won the Top Box Office Films Award at the ASCAP Film and Television Music Awards. In 2009, Horton Hears a Who was nominated for Best Animated Film at the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. At the Annie Awards, there were 5 nominations. Alan Lay was nominated for Best Animated Effects. Jeff Gabor was nominated for Best Character Animation in a Feature Production. Song-Joon Lee was nominated for Best Character Design in an Animated Feature Production. John Powell was nominated for Best Music in an Animated Feature Production, and Cinco Paul and Ken Dario were both nominated for Best Writing in an Animated Feature Production. At the Satellite Awards, Horton Hears a Who was nominated in 2008 at the Satellite Awards. Horton Hears a Who was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Animated, or Mixed Media, and John Powell was nominated for the Best Original Score. And at the Kids' Choice Awards in 2009, Jim Carrey was nominated for the Favorite Voice from an Animated Movie. Now, there are quite a few more awards here. If you would like to go through the rest of them, you can find all of them on the IMDb awards website for Horton Hears a Who, but we're going to wrap this up real quick with one very important lesson we can all learn from Horton Hears a Who, and that, my friends, would be a person's a person, no matter how small. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you all in the next episode.